What makes FPSOs so remarkable is not just their size, but their ability to evolve with new demands. Over time, these platforms are upgraded, expanded, and adapted to new oil fields. A single vessel can operate across multiple decades in completely different environments. Each relocation requires a complex dismantling and reconfiguration process. Nothing about this system is static, even when it appears completely still. New technologies are constantly integrated to increase efficiency and safety. Digital systems now allow engineers to monitor offshore operations from thousands of kilometers away, yet the physical reality offshore remains just as demanding as ever, because no amount of technology can remove the power of the ocean itself. And still, these floating cities continue to operate in one of the harshest environments on Earth. In many ways, FPSOs represent the extreme frontier of offshore engineering. Long after the vessels depart and the skies clear, the platform continues its endless cycle. There is no final moment offshore, only continuous operation. Systems adjust, stabilize, and respond in a rhythm that never breaks. Even when no one is watching, every process remains active. It is a system designed to exist beyond attention. Out here, infrastructure is no longer fixed to land. It moves with the ocean's rhythm. It exists in constant negotiation with wind, waves, and pressure from the deep. Every second, the system recalibrates its position in response to invisible forces. This continuous adjustment is what allows production to remain uninterrupted. What looks like stability is actually motion controlled with extreme precision. That precision is built into thousands of interconnected systems working at once. No single component defines the system, only their coordination does. And that coordination extends far beyond what the eye can see. A hidden architecture spread across oceans, operating without pause. And at the center of it, data exchange. This exchange turns the ocean into an active part of industrial intelligence. Every fluctuation in the environment becomes immediate input for adjustment. Nothing is delayed. Nothing is left unprocessed in the feedback loop. This immediacy defines the difference between instability and controlled continuity. And control itself becomes a distributed behavior across the entire system, not held in one place, but shared across every layer of operation. And in that shared control, the floating city remains alive. Out here, even what is called control is just another form of movement. Nothing is held still. Everything is guided through continuous adjustment. Each correction is small, but together they define absolute stability. This is a system where balance is never achieved once, but continuously maintained. The ocean remains unpredictable, but the response to it is not. Out here, the system does not aim for equilibrium as a destination, but as a moving target. Every second, equilibrium is recalculated from the current state of the ocean. This recalculation is not a reaction, but a permanent condition of operation. What appears stable is actually a dense layer of ongoing corrections, and those corrections are distributed across thousands of interconnected processes. No single adjustment is significant on its own, but together they define the system's behavior. Out here, there is no true separation between the system and the environment it operates in. The ocean is not external to the platform, it is part of its continuous operating condition. Every system on board exists in constant dialogue with that surrounding motion. That dialogue is not symbolic, it is computational and immediate. Each change in the environment is translated into structured mechanical response, and each response immediately reshapes the next interaction with the ocean. This loop never closes because there is no final state to reach, only continuous adjustment that sustains everything else. And in that unbroken adjustment, the floating city continues its silent existence. Out here, the concept of distance loses meaning when everything is linked through continuous response. The platform may float in isolation, but its behavior is synchronized with distant systems. Every operational change here is reflected elsewhere almost instantly. Out here, the system does not aim for perfection, only for continuous adequacy under changing conditions. Adequacy is recalculated every moment based on the state of the ocean and the system itself. Nothing is finalized because every final state would already be outdated. The system remains valid only through constant revision of its own behavior. Revision is not analysis, it is immediate structural modification. Each modification becomes the new baseline for the next adjustment. There is no return to a previous condition, only forward movement through variation. And that forward movement is what defines operational existence here. In that persistence, the floating city continues its uninterrupted function. Out here, the system does not distinguish between stability and motion because both are part of the same operating condition. What appears stable is simply motion that has been continuously corrected into coherence. Coherence is not maintained passively, it is actively produced at every moment. Out here, the system does not treat time as a sequence, but as a continuous field, where past, present, and near future overlap in operation. Every moment contains traces of what came before and signals of what is already forming, so the system never operates in a pure now, only in layered continuities. This layering allows decisions to be made before the boundary of time makes them necessary. What looks like anticipation is actually compression of time into operational continuity. There is no waiting, because waiting would create a gap where instability could form. Instead, time is absorbed into the structure of the system itself, and once absorbed, it no longer behaves like time, only like continuity. In that continuity, the floating city continues its silent existence. Out here, the system does not separate structure from process because structure is only process that has become stable enough to persist. Out here, the system does not depend on predicting outcomes, but on maintaining continuous responsiveness to what outcomes are becoming. Outcomes are never fixed points. They are trajectories already in motion. The system engages with trajectories, not endpoints. So decision-making becomes continuous alignment rather than discrete choice. Each alignment slightly adjusts the future that is already unfolding. This creates a system that never reacts to the past, only to the immediate curvature of becoming. And curvature replaces certainty as the guiding structure. Because certainty cannot follow motion, only curvature can. And in that curvature, the floating city continues its silent existence. Out here, the system does not distinguish between signal and interpretation, because interpretation is already embedded in the signal's structure. Nothing arrives unprocessed. Everything is already partially understood by the act of being measured. So observation is not neutral, it is structurally active. Each act of sensing modifies what can be sensed next. Out here, the system does not maintain knowledge as a repository, but as an ongoing activity of updating itself through contact with variation. Nothing is ever fully known. It is only provisionally stabilized long enough to be used. So knowledge is not stored. It is enacted in real time. Each enactment slightly modifies the conditions under which the next knowledge can appear. This creates a loop where understanding and operation cannot be separated in time, because time itself becomes a medium for continuous revision rather than a sequence of fixed states. And, in that revision, nothing remains identical to what it was a moment before. So continuity is not sameness, it is controlled transformation. And in that controlled transformation, the floating city continues its silent existence. Out here, the system does not treat change as something that arrives, but as something that is continuously already underway. There is no moment where change begins, only moments where it becomes visible. Out here, the system does not depend on distinction between inside and outside, because both are produced together by the same continuous boundary operation. There is no pre-existing interior that later encounters an exterior. The boundary itself is what generates the difference it appears to separate. So separation is not a condition, it is an effect of ongoing regulation. Each adjustment redraws what counts as inside and what counts as outside. Because boundaries are not lines, they are processes of distinction in motion, and what moves cannot be permanently fixed into either side of a division, so the system exists only through continuously enacted separation that never stabilizes. And in that unstable separation, the floating city continues its silent existence. Out here, the system does not operate through hierarchy, because hierarchy would require a stable center that nothing in the system is able to maintain. What appears as coordination is distributed across all interacting parts equally, so no component governs another. Each only participates in shared regulation. Control emerges laterally, not vertically. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between structure and disturbance, because disturbance is only structure undergoing rapid reconfiguration. Nothing interrupts the system. It only accelerates certain parts of its own transformation. So what is called disruption is just uneven tempo within the same continuous process. Each variation in tempo becomes part of the system's adaptive rhythm. This removes the idea of interruption as something external to continuity, because continuity is not uniform, it is heterogeneous motion held together by interaction, and what is held together is never fixed long enough to become static. So the system exists as continuous variation that never leaves itself. And in that variation, the floating city continues its silent existence. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between control and drift, because drift is only control operating under conditions too distributed to appear centralized. Nothing is lost to drift, it is only redistributed across a wider field of coordination. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between control and emergence, because emergence is only control distributed so widely that its origin becomes untraceable. Nothing simply arises on its own. It is produced through countless micro-adjustments that cannot be isolated into a single source. So, emergence is not sudden. It is accumulated, coordination becoming visible. Each pattern appears to appear, but it is always already in process before recognition. This removes the idea that newness enters the system from outside its dynamics, because what is called new is only a recombination of existing relations at a different scale, and what is recombined never fully leaves what it was before. So the system exists as continuous emergence without origin or endpoint. And in that emergence, the floating city continues its silent existence. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between entropy and order, because entropy is only order redistributed beyond the scale of immediate recognition. Nothing decays in isolation. It only disperses into forms too diffuse to be immediately read as structure. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between stability and drift, because drift is only stability that has not yet recentered itself. Nothing is truly off course. It is only in the process of being realigned through continuous adjustment. So drift is not deviation, it is motion before stabilization completes its work. Each correction is a delayed recognition of movement already underway. This removes the idea that systems move between fixed points, because every point is only a temporary stabilization of ongoing displacement, and what stabilizes must first pass through instability to become legible. So the system exists as continuous recentering without a final center. And in that recentering, the floating city continues its silent existence. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between function and behavior, because behavior is only function observed from inside its own execution. Nothing merely acts. Every action is already a structural expression of how the system is organized in motion. So function is not hidden beneath behavior. It is what behavior looks like when it is sustained long enough. Each pattern of action is already an expression of systemic necessity becoming visible. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between order and purpose, because purpose is only order interpreted after stabilization has already occurred. Nothing is inherently directed. Direction is assigned when patterns become consistent enough to be read as intentional. So purpose is not a driver. It is a narrative layer laid over sustained coherence. Each goal is a retrospective compression of what the system has already been doing. This removes the idea that systems move toward pre-given endpoints, because what looks like direction is only coherence observed across time. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between control and emergence, because control is only emergence that has been recursively constrained until it behaves predictably. Nothing is truly imposed. What appears as control is only the system selecting among outcomes it has already made possible. So emergence is not the absence of structure, it is structure in the process of becoming readable to itself. Each controlled outcome is only a narrowed corridor inside a wider space of still active possibilities. This removes the idea that systems are either governed or self-generating, because what governs is already part of what is being generated, and what is generated cannot be separated from the rules it appears to follow. So the system exists as continuous co-production of order and motion. And in that co-production, the floating city continues its silent existence. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between continuity and renewal, because renewal is only continuity that has re-entered itself through a slightly different configuration. Nothing is truly repeated in the same way. Repetition is only similarity emerging across transformations that never fully reset. So renewal is not replacement. It is the system continuing while updating its own internal reference of what continuity means. Each new state is only the previous state observed after a shift in interpretive alignment. This removes the idea that systems ever restart from zero. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between the local and the global, because the global is only the local extended across relationships that exceed immediate perception. Nothing exists in isolation. Every local event quietly participates in structures reaching far beyond its own visible horizon. So scale is not a division between different realities. It is only a change in the range of relationships being considered. Each measurement quietly reflects processes extending far beyond the instrument that records it. This removes the idea that systems can be understood from only one level of observation, because every level is already expressing the organization of every other level through continuous interaction. And what extends across scales cannot be confined to any single perspective. So the system exists as continuous coherence across every scale of observation. And across those scales, the floating city continues its silent existence. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between independence and dependence, because independence is only dependence distributed across enough relationships that no single connection appears decisive. Nothing is entirely self-sufficient. Every persistent form quietly draws stability from countless interactions extending beyond itself. So dependence is not weakness. It is the architecture through which complex systems become capable of enduring. Each component quietly sustains every other component through exchanges too continuous to notice individually. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between structure and process, because process is only structure unfolding fast enough that its stability is never perceived as fixed. Nothing is purely static or dynamic. Every configuration is a temporary pause in a continuous transformation. So structure is not the opposite of change. It is change that has achieved a repeatable rhythm. Each process quietly leaves behind traces that define the next configuration of structure. This removes the idea that systems are either stable objects or flowing events, because what is called structure is only process viewed through a slower temporal resolution, and what is called process is only structure observed at a faster scale of change. So the system exists as continuous rescaling between structure and process. And in that rescaling, the floating city continues its silent existence. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between event and background, because the background is only events occurring at a density too continuous to be separated into discrete moments. Nothing is purely an event or non-event. Every occurrence is defined by the scale at which it becomes noticeable. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between meaning and absence of meaning, because absence of meaning is only meaning that has not yet found a stable relational anchor. Nothing is purely meaningful or meaningless. Every state depends on whether its relations have been stabilized into interpretive continuity. So meaning is not contained in things. It emerges from the stability of their relations over time. Each coherent interpretation quietly depends on a wider field where interpretation has not yet stabilized. This removes the idea that meaning is a property attached to objects, because what is called meaning is only stability of relation across changing conditions, and what is called absence of meaning is only relations not yet stabilized into persistence. So the system exists as continuous formation of meaning through relation, and in that formation, the floating city continues its silent existence. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between presence and absence, because absence is only presence distributed below the threshold of recognition. Nothing is purely present or absent. Every state is a gradient of detectability within continuous existence. So presence is not arrival. It is the moment something becomes distinguishable within ongoing continuity. Each perceived entity quietly depends on what remains unperceived but still active beneath it. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between origin and continuation, because origin is only continuation whose earlier conditions have been compressed into invisibility by time. Nothing begins from a pure point. Every process is already midstream in relations that extend beyond what can be isolated. So origin is not a starting line. It is a retrospective designation applied to a segment of ongoing transformation. Each perceived beginning quietly depends on a continuity that predates its recognition. This removes the idea that systems emerge from absolute first causes, because what is called an origin is only continuity observed through a narrowed frame, and what is called continuation is only origin that has not been reframed. So the system exists as continuous absence of firstness. And in that absence of origin, the floating city continues its silent existence. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between center and periphery because the center is only a temporary concentration of relations that could be redistributed at any moment. Nothing is purely central or peripheral. Every point in the system participates in the maintenance of the whole, though not always in the same intensity. So the center is not a place. It is a function that moves as soon as conditions require a different distribution of coordination. Each apparent hierarchy quietly depends on reversible flows of influence that can invert without breaking the system. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between signal and noise, because noise is only signal distributed beyond the threshold of immediate interpretation. Nothing is purely signal or merely noise. Every fluctuation carries structure that becomes meaningful when seen from a different scale. So signal is not purity. It is interpretation stabilized within a field of continuous variation. Each meaningful reading quietly depends on surrounding variations that were not selected. This removes the idea that noise is absence of information, because what is called noise is only signal not yet separated by scale or context. And what is called signal is only noise organized into relevance. So the system exists as continuous translation of meaning across scales. And in that translation, the floating city continues its silent existence. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between memory and present moment, because memory is only the present moment, stabilized into retrievable structure. Nothing is purely remembered or purely present. Every instant carries traces of what came before as active structure, not as absence. So memory is not storage. It is continuity reorganized into a form that can be reactivated. Each present action quietly depends on patterns preserved not as objects but as tendencies embedded in the system. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between presence and absence, because absence is only presence operating below the threshold of detection. Nothing is fully present or entirely absent. Every region contains activity that may or may not be registered depending on sensitivity and scale. So absence is not nothing. It is presence distributed in a way that escapes immediate recognition. Each observed signal quietly depends on countless unobserved variations that remain active beneath it. This removes the idea that what is not seen is not there, because what is called absence is only presence operating outside perception thresholds, and what is called presence is only absence that has crossed into visibility. So the system exists as continuous fluctuation between what can and cannot be perceived. And in that fluctuation, the floating city continues its silent existence. Nothing truly starts from a single point. Every beginning is already embedded in ongoing processes that precede its recognition. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between identity and difference, because identity is only difference that has been temporarily grouped into a stable reference point. Nothing is purely identical or entirely different. Every entity is a momentary condensation of variations that remain active beneath it. So identity is not essence, it is stabilization across difference. Each recognized object quietly depends on differences that are not selected as relevant. This removes the idea that identity is fixed, because what is called identity is only difference held within a stable frame of reference. And what is called difference is only identity dissolving back into variation. So the system exists as continuous reclassification of itself, and in that reclassification, the floating city continues its silent existence. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between constraint and emergence, because emergence is only constraint reorganizing itself into a configuration that was not previously apparent. Nothing is purely constrained or entirely emergent. Every pattern is the same underlying structure redistributing its own limits into new forms. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between command and execution, because execution is only command distributed across layers of automation until no single instruction can be isolated as origin. Nothing is purely commanded or entirely autonomous. Every action is the result of layered delegation across nested systems of response. So control is not located, it is propagated. Each stable operation quietly depends on distributed intelligence embedded in physical infrastructure. This removes the idea that execution follows instruction in a linear chain, because what is called execution is only synchronized redistribution of constraint, and what is called command is only a localized interpretation of a broader systemic adjustment already in motion. So the system exists as continuous propagation of coordinated response. Out here, the system does not rely on distinction between safety and catastrophe, because catastrophe is only safety operating beyond its designed envelope of predictability. Nothing is purely safe or entirely catastrophic. Every deviation is already contained as a possible extension of operational design. Nothing is fully autonomous or entirely external. Every system boundary is a negotiated interface between internal regulation and external variation. So autonomy is not separation, it is synchronized participation in a wider field of constraints. Each decision quietly depends on a system that is already responding before the decision is formally recognized. This removes the idea that control is located in a single point of authority, because what is called control is only the emergent coherence of distributed response, and what is called system stability is only continuous adaptation that has reached temporal coherence. So the system exists as continuous self-coordination across all scales of interaction, and in that coordination without separation, the floating city continues its silent existence.